It was a dusky evening in the small frontier town of Dry Creek, where the dusty winds carried the scent of sagebrush, and the long whistle of the evening train echoed across the hills, when a cowboy named Luke Carson, tall, lean, and hardened by years on the trail, rode into town with his horse, Shadow trotting faithfully beside him, his heart weary from weeks of wrangling cattle and his stomach gnawing, with hunger that no jerky or beans could satisfy. And it was in that hunger-driven haze that he spotted a small sign nailed to the door of a weathered shack just outside the saloon that read simply, "Cook for hire," and though he'd never been the kind of man to think about hiring help, he found his boots leading him through the threshold, where a tired but hopeful woman named Clara stood with flower-streaked hands and eyes that spoke of 100 burdens. And Luke, shifting uncomfortably under the glow of the lantern, muttered in his rough cowboy drawl that he needed someone to fix a meal for him and his girl that night, since his girl Mary Lou was riding into town from the ranch after a long spell, and he wanted the evening to be special, a little taste of comfort instead of the usual burnt beans he offered. And Clara, grateful for the chance to earn a few dollars and prove her worth, agreed with a polite nod, pulling out pots and pans from her worn satchel like a magician producing gold. And soon the shack was alive with the crackle of bacon, the hiss of cornbread batter poured into a skillet, and the savory aroma of stew bubbling over the fire. And Luke, leaning against the doorframe, found himself watching her movements with a strange mix of admiration and unease. For though he had hired her hands for cooking, there was something about the way she carried herself, resilient, yet fragile, that made him feel a tug deep in his chest, a tug he quickly ignored as the sound of hooves clattered outside, signaling Mary Lou's arrival. And when she entered, her dress bright against the dusty backdrop, her laughter filling the small space, she froze at the sight of Clara at the stove. And though Luke explained quickly that he'd hired a cook just for the night, Mary Lou's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing with something between jealousy and curiosity, until Clara stepped forward, offered her hand, and said softly that she was only there to serve. Nothing more, but Mary Lou, sharp as a whip and unafraid to speak her mind, replied with a voice that cut through the room that sometimes the things a man hires for a night end up changing his life forever. And in that moment the air thickened, the meal on the table forgotten, for Mary Lou's words were less about Clara and more about Luke, about the choices he made, the way he sought comfort without thinking how it would look or what it meant. And Luke, struck by her honesty, realized that the night was not about food or ease, but about truth, about what kind of man he wanted to be in her eyes. And though the meal was delicious and Clara's hands had worked wonders, it was Mary Lou's sharp words that lingered after the plates were cleared, words that would ripple through Luke's heart like a stone cast into a pond, pushing him toward decisions he had never imagined, decisions that would test his loyalty, his pride, and his understanding of what love and sacrifice truly meant. For in the Wild West, where men often lived by instinct and grit, it was rare for a cowboy to be shaken by a woman's voice. But Mary Lou's voice was not just a voice. It was a compass, pointing him toward something greater than himself. And as the night drew on and the lantern dimmed, Luke lay awake listening to the soft breathing of Shadow outside and the distant hum of the town settling into silence, knowing that though he had only hired a cook one night, what his girl said had changed everything. And dear viewers, if you want to know how Luke's choices unfold, how Mary Lou's words become the seed of a story that grows beyond hunger, beyond jealousy, and into something that would define their very lives, then stay with me for Chapter 2. And before we ride further into this tale of grit, heart, and transformation, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, tales of the Old West that dig into the human spirit, deserve to be heard, and your support helps keep these journeys alive. So saddle up and join the ride. The next morning broke with a pale sun rising over Dry Creek, painting the horizon in shades of gold and fire. But for Luke Carson, sleep had offered little peace. For Mary Lou's words from the night before still echoed in his chest, gnawing at him harder than hunger ever could. And as he saddled Shadow with weary hands, he thought about Clara, the cook he had hired for one night, and how she had left quietly after the meal, leaving behind only the faint scent of cornbread and the memory of a woman trying to carve dignity from a world that had given her little. And he thought about Mary Lou, her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, how her voice had carried truth, not bitterness. And though he felt stung, he knew she had spoken because she loved him enough not to let him drift into thoughtless choices. And that was what separated her from others. She was not afraid to shape him into a better man, and that truth sat heavy in his soul as he rode out to the ranch, where the cattle lowed and the dust rose thick around the herds. But even among the work, the weight of the previous night lingered, until by midday he found himself riding back into town, not for supplies or whiskey, but for answers. And those answers began with Clara, for he knew he had hired her for a meal, but there had been something in her eyes, a storm of pain and pride, that told him her story was deeper than a skillet and a stew. So he asked around, and the whispers that floated back told of a woman widowed too young, left with no land and no kin, surviving by the work of her hands. And though some townsfolk pitied her, others mocked her, as frontier towns often did when a woman stood alone. And it struck Luke hard, because while he had Mary Lou to steady him, Clara had nothing but her grit, and perhaps Mary Lou's words about one night changing a life rang truer than he'd understood. For Clara's presence, though brief, had forced him to look at himself differently, to question how quick he was to use people as conveniences instead of seeing them as souls. And as he walked through town, his boots stirring the dust, he saw Mary Lou standing by the general store, her arms crossed, her face set like stone, and he knew this was the moment to prove her words had changed him. So he walked straight to her, tipping his hat not out of habit but out of humility, and he told her plain and honest that she had been right, that a man's choices, even simple ones like hiring a cook for one night, revealed his character, and he didn't want to be the kind of man who used people and left them behind like worn boots. And Mary Lou, though her lips tightened, softened in the eyes, for she saw the sincerity in him, and she asked him what he planned to do about it. And Luke, with no plan but with a heart full of resolve, said he was going to help Clara find steadiness again, not as a savior but as a man who recognized worth. And Mary Lou, after a long pause, said softly that if he could do that, then maybe what she said truly had changed everything. And together they walked to the shack where Clara stayed, the smell of flour and wood smoke drifting faintly through the cracks. And when Clara opened the door, surprise flashing across her weary face, Luke told her that he wanted to hire her again, not just for one night but for the ranch, for as long as she needed work, because the ranch always needed steady hands. And though it wasn't common for cowboys to bring cooks into their crew, Luke didn't care about common anymore. He cared about what was right, and Clara, stunned, tried to refuse at first, thinking it was pity. But Mary Lou stepped forward, her voice steady as steel, and told her it wasn't pity, it was respect, and no woman should be ashamed of honest work. And for the first time in years, Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, not of sorrow but of relief. And that night, as the three of them sat around a fire, the stars spread like spilled diamonds above. Clara stirred a pot of stew while Luke leaned against a log, and Mary Lou hummed softly beside him, and in that quiet, Luke realized that what his girl had said had indeed changed everything, for her words had turned a cowboy's careless act into a moment of truth, had turned a lonely widow into part of a family, and had turned his own path from one of drifting survival into one of purpose. And as he stared into the fire, he thought of all the cowboys out there who believed they could ride through life without listening to the women who loved them, and he knew they were wrong, for it was Mary Lou's voice that had given him direction, Clara's resilience that had given him perspective, and his own humility that had given him the courage to change. And dear viewers, as this story of grit, love, and second chances closes under the western stars, I invite you to think about your own journey, about the voices in your life that guide you when you least expect it. And if you've ridden this far with me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories ahead. Stories of cowboys and courage, of women with voices that change lives, of choices that seem small but ripple through eternity. And your support keeps these campfires burning, these tales alive. So join the ride and let's keep traveling together. Because in every story, just like in life, it only takes one moment, one word, one truth to change everything.